Do a little housekeeping to say that this is the last Sunday of the quarter, the last Sunday of this lesson book that we kind of substituted in this quarter, and we've gotten a lot of positive feedback. A lot of people have told us they've enjoyed using this book. We'll be going back to the Gospel Advocate Quarterly for next quarter, but then in the summer we're going to pivot back to maybe a companion book to what we've studied this quarter out of another Winkler publication. So it'll be the same series of books. This quarter's been the mission of the local church, and then in the summer I believe we'll be doing a study called A Blueprint for Church Growth. So we'll talk about the mission of the church this quarter, and then we'll once we know the mission, strategies for church growth. And so I trust that'll be a positive and enjoyable study as well, like this one has been. We've mentioned over and over through this lesson what in essence at the end of it all, what the mission of the local church is, and we've said it time and time again, and that is seek and save the lost, to go make disciples. And most of this book has been talking about ways in which we do that. This last lesson is titled, Shall Your Brethren Go to War, and Shall Ye Sit Here? And that comes from the book of Numbers. Now, obviously, this section, Numbers 32, is not a direct correlation to worship or the mission of the church necessarily. What we have here, as the tribes are conquering the land, in chapter 32, they've gotten to the east of Jordan and preparing to cross over the Jordan. And a couple of the tribes, specifically Reuben and Gad, the Reubenites and Gadites, go to Moses and say, basically, we're happy with this land on this side of the Jordan. We want this land. And we find that in verse 1. Now the children of Reuben and the children of Gad had a very great multitude of livestock, and when they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, that indeed the region was a place for livestock, the children of Gad and the children of Reuben came and spoke to Moses, to Eleazar the priest, and to the leaders of the congregation, saying, essentially, we want this part of the land. Now, Moses hears this, and Moses, instead of just hearing, we want this part of the land, Moses hears, we want this part of the land, and we're just going to stay here and let you guys go on. And so Moses, we read a little bit of irritation in Moses' voice as he goes into his, you might even say rebuke to them, and he says in verse 6, and Moses said to the children of Gad and to the children of Reuben, shall your brethren go to war while you sit here? Essentially saying, we still have some conquering to do. We've been given this land, but we still have to cross over the Jordan. We have to conquer the rest of the land, and you're telling me you want this land. You want to stay here. Are you going to sit here and let everybody else go and finish the job that God has given us? And he goes in and reminds them of the first time that they had they looked at conquering the land, and they sent the spies, and Joshua and Caleb came back and said, yeah, we can do this. Everybody else said no, and what happened? They wandered. And Moses recalls that to say, are you doubting? Or what's wrong here? Are you going to send everybody else to do the job, and you stay here? Now, what was their response? It might have been a long time since you've read Numbers 32. Their response was essentially, we're going to set up our camp here. We're going to make provisions for our livestock, but don't worry, we're going to go to war with you, and when all of our brethren have their inheritance, then we'll return. Essentially, they tell Moses, don't worry. We're still in for the fight. We know what God's given us. We know we all have an inheritance to receive. And before we settle down, we're going to make sure not only we have our inheritance that we're asking you for, but that all of our brethren have theirs too. And so that comes to the gist of this lesson in verse 6. Shall your brethren go to war while you sit here? Now, fast forward to the New Testament, and fast forward to the mission of the church. And although this is a lesson on, or that was an example of a lesson on battle, what has the Christian life been compared to? A war. A battle. This is where we get this parallel with this lesson. Ephesians chapter 6 talks about the whole armor of God. We did that in a VBS not too long ago. We went through every piece of armor, and the illustration there is that as a Christian, we are a soldier in God's army, carrying out the mission that we have. 1 Timothy 6:12 says that we are to fight the good fight. 2 Timothy 2, verses 3 and 4 discuss being a good soldier of Jesus Christ. So, using this parallel, the lesson here is that we have this mission, and it's been compared to a battle, to a war against what? Sin, Satan. Unrighteousness, evil. It can snowball. And the lesson we take from this is we have to fight together. We have to do it together as a body. Moses was, he did not have a problem with the children of Gad and the children of Reuben wanting that land that they saw east of the Jordan. At the end of it, he basically says, you can have this land as long as everybody else gets theirs and you help. You can have that land. It wasn't what they wanted that was the problem. He was afraid that they were just going to sit back and let everybody else go finish the fight while they sit back and just take what they've already got, rest on their laurels. He said, it was essentially that we've got to work together. Ephesians chapter 1 talks about that we are one body. Ephesians 1 is that 1, 22 and 23, the ones. We are not, especially within a local congregation, and that's the main focus of this lesson, especially in the local congregation. We're to act as one people. Whenever a local church shows division, that's really hard to convince others to listen to your argument. You can't even agree with yourselves. But we're also one as the body of Christ, with sister congregations the world over. And we're all fighting this fight against darkness, this fight against Satan, this fight to seek out and save the lost, to make disciples, and working together, a cooperation is the best way to make that happen. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 9. We'll flip over there. Chris, I couldn't make it. I thought if I stood under the fan, I could handle that jacket, but it's not happening. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 9. This is one of those instances where I think I like the verbiage of the King James Version better than the New King James. New King James says, "For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, you are God's building." King James, I believe, says we are laborers together with God. I guess there's three things you get out of that. Number one, laborers. We're to be about work. There are some who really harp on that work thing, that there's nothing that you've got to do, and we'll talk about a little bit more. But the nature of a Christian is to want to work. If you love God, you will do His work. So number one, as Christians in the local church, we are to be laborers, working. Now, working how? Working together. Not working against each other. I think we've all seen congregations and groups of the church, whether within a congregation, working against each other, or congregations that are divergent of each other and working against each other in that way. But working together, as long as we're working towards scriptural things. But maybe the most important of that is laborers together with who? With God. Nothing that we do, nothing that we work towards, if we're not doing it with God, then why are we doing it? If we're not doing it based on what God's told us to do in the Scriptures, then it's in vain. So we have to take all three of those. Laborers together with God. Now, just because there are... We're focusing on this idea of laborers together, working together. That doesn't mean that we don't have individual responsibilities. Romans chapter 14 and verse 12 tells us that we will that would help if I was in the right chapter. Romans 14:12. This is not going well. So then each of us shall give account to himself to God. 2 Corinthians 5:10 says that we will all appear, and all appear before God, and each one of us will receive from Him according to what we've done. Galatians 6 verse 5 tells us that each one will bear his own load. Too often we find ourselves being part of a congregation that's doing good works, that's doing good things. There are good programs, but we're not involved in them. You know, we can't say that our church does this and not ever do any of it. There are so many needs in a community, so many needs within the church to work in the community. If we're talking about the mission of the local church, we've talked about a lot of it over the time, from the way we worship to the way we interact with the community. But it's not enough to say, yeah, my church does that. But if you don't do any of it, are you really genuine about it? We each have a role to play in the church. And the important part is to find what your role is. How can you help? What can you do? What program can you take part in that reaches out to people? Is it teaching Bible study? Is it being part of the visitation program? Is it taking care of the building? Is it whatever it is? What do you do to further the mission of the local church? If all you're doing is coming to worship service and Bible class and then leaving, we'll talk in a minute how that's not work. That's worship, and that's great. But that's not working in the church. So we all have to do it together. We have to do it we have individual responsibilities, working together, fellow laborers with God. So, with the premise of the statement of Moses, are you going to sit here while your brothers go to war? Why then do people choose to sit? Because that's really the essence of this lesson, right? There's obviously an inference that there are people who sit and don't go to war, don't work to further the mission of the church. And in order to fix that problem, and I think we all understand that that is a problem. If you're not doing anything to further the gospel, there is a problem there. We need to find out the reasons. The book listed a number of potential reasons, and we'll go through those as we get it. But what's your take? What are some reasons, Eric?
Well, in numbers, they were fearful, I think, was one of the reasons, along with others. But they were fearful of going into battle and going to fight for others. And I think sometimes we are as well. We're fearful of going out there for a lot of different reasons.
Mm-hmm. I think that could correlate to one of the points in the book was lack of faith. I think that's a real good correlation, lack of faith. Hebrews chapter 11 is that, the faith book. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand the worlds were framed by the word of God. So the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. And it goes through in the power of faith and what faith gave a number of patriarchs the power to do, or the confidence to do, I guess you should say. So absolutely, fear. And I think that's a big one. That may be one of the biggest reasons that work doesn't get done as far as person-to-person, what will you say, personal evangelism, personal work. How's my friend, how's my coworker, how's my stranger next to me going to respond? So lack of faith, that we don't have God behind us.
We tend to, it's not the first place we go when we deal with fear. It's, I've got a lack of skill. I've got a lack of courage. I've got a lack of, you just fill in the blank. And it's real easy to sit still when you look at yourself and realize how weak and insignificant or whatever your flavor of the month is, when the whole point is it's about, do you have faith that God has the strength and Christ has the strength? Because when they were in that boat with Jesus and they were scared and he calmed it, what did he tell them? You with faith.
Mm-hmm.
Where's your faith? You think the Lord God is going to allow his son to die in a boat? But we tend to look at ourselves and we look at our inabilities rather than having faith in God's ability.
Looking back at some of the things that these examples were able to do because of faith in Hebrews 11, you go to verse 29, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. So fear and a lack of faith would be one. What's another reason why we sit instead of go to war?
Jeremy, I think priorities. A lot of times we get so, what we think is so busy in our worldly affairs that sometimes we put them ahead of what the most important thing is.
Mm-hmm.
Say, I'd like to do more, but I'm so busy with work or with family or with whatever. Again, fill in the blanks, like Barry said, that we've got our priorities all wrong.
We're packed full of things to do. I'm guilty of being a stretch myself too thin kind of person. And as the kids have gotten older and into more things, I've had to start saying no to some of those other things so I could take care of stuff I need to do. But it's hard to say no to stuff. And so we get ourselves too thinned out and too many other things to do. Chris, I think you had something.
Well, I noticed reading through here, the book points out a lot of character flaws, whether it's indifference or a lack of love or lack of faith. And I'm sure that's the case in a lot of cases, but I think too we've got to give people opportunity
And sometimes, if you're a fairly new Christian, you may not see the opportunities that are out there. And it's probably up to us that have maybe been Christians a little longer to share the workload. And we can be guilty of not wanting to share the workload. Or, I know how to do this. I've always done it. And I can do it better than somebody else and faster than if I taught somebody else to do it. But that's not how people grow.
Step on my toes, Chris. Thanks.
Yeah. In the world, we use things like succession planning,
Yeah.
delegation, and they push. And those of us who are slightly workaholics, we tend to want to, take in everything and not give out anything. And we bring that into the Lord's church. And, who's going to be running this show in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, if we don't teach and,
Pass it on.
Pass it on. And
I think back to, was it 2 Sundays ago that Jeff Archie was here? Was it 2 Sundays? And he was talking about the structure of the church and how in the church we've gotten into a bad place in some congregations where leadership and delegation is all out of whack. Preachers are doing work of elders, and elders are doing work of deacons, and deacons don't know what to do. And it comes back to a lot of that. Sometimes it's just easier to do it instead of making sure someone else does it right. So absolutely, we need to be willing to delegate and willing to let people try and maybe even let people fail in some of the work. Any others? Josh?
Just kind of correlating the whole parallel that you've been talking about this morning about the church and going into battle and everybody working together, divvying out their tasks. Thinking about in Joshua where we had studied the tribes that were coming into Canaan to get their inherited lands. 2 of the tribes were on the other side of the Jordan, and actually they were already set and really didn't have to do anything. Their livestock was set, but there were 10 of the other tribes that did need to cross the Jordan and actually go into battle. Even though these 2 tribes didn't have to, they were all called to fight together, and that's kind of an example of divvying out things, and even if it's something that you feel like maybe you already taken care of, you don't have to do it, we're all kind of working together.
Wasn't it?
It's an admirable thing.
Wasn't it Moses who was trying to judge the people all by himself on all matters, and his father-in-law said, basically, you're going to wear yourself out? You can't do everything. So sometimes we need to give each other something to do and physically go to somebody and say, hey, I really need help with this. Can you help me? Any others?
I was going to say, I can't do much, but I do ask people to come to church, and they have some excuse why they can't, or they go to a different church, and it's a real struggle. Just asking people to come to church.
Yeah, it is. And some can do little, and some can do much. The parable of talents is exactly what that's teaching. Everybody can do something, and as long as you're doing what you can do, you're working for the Lord. Going through, I'm going to go through some of the ones that we've not hit on that were in the book, and then if we have time, I'll open it back up. But there are some that I'd like to make sure we hit on. One being indifference. What was the problem with Ephesians and the Ephesians and the Laodiceans in the Revelation? The Laodiceans especially, what did he say? You are lukewarm. You just don't really care. You're not hot. You're not cold. You're doing the church more damage because you look like you're doing good, but you're really not caring so much. So indifference is one. The book says spiritual indolence. Now, I had to look up indolence, but what does indolence mean?
Lack of motivation.
Yeah, laziness. Laziness is the definition that I came up with, and I had to look at that. So spiritual laziness. Let's not use the big words. Spiritual laziness.
like sluggards.
Yeah. Yeah. How should we be? What's that Z word that we come across?
Should be zealous.
That's it. That's the Z word. Zealous. Titus 2:14 says, zealous of good works. When we are members of the body of Christ and there are things to do, we should want to do them and be excited to do them. Because we have this gift that we can share to people. That means more than anything. Romans 12:11 says, not slothful or not lagging. Laying back and just not really motivated. A third one that the book had, resting upon others. What does that mean? Resting upon others.
Lazy.
Well, maybe not as much. We covered lazy.
You're sitting on the bench.
You're sitting on the bench. Why? Because there's somebody else.
Yeah, you think somebody else should start, and so I'll just sit here, and I'm not capable of this, I'm not capable of that, so I'll just sit back, and I'm part of the team, though.
Yeah. On the practice squad. 1 Peter 2, verse 5. Somewhat addresses this. 1 Peter 2. Starting verse 4, coming to him as a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. You also, verse 5, as living stones are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. We talk about Christ being the cornerstone, but as Christians, we are all stones. We're all living stones. We're all pieces of the foundation of the church. Yeah, Christ is the cornerstone. He's the one that makes it stable. But every one of us, individual, has a part to play in keeping the church solid and strong for years and years and years to come. Remember again, we mentioned Galatians 6:5. Each one has to bear his own load, bear his own burdens. We can't let someone else score all the points. So rest on others. Now we talked about lack of faith. Another one is a lack of love. What does love do? In terms of Scripture, what does love for God do for us?
It lifts us up.
It should also motivate us. Look at John 14. John 14 is the chapter that talks a little bit about love here. John 14, verse 21 says, he who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? Verse 23, Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. Love motivates us. True love of Christ, true love of God, will motivate us to do what he asks us to do. Not having true love lets us slip into that indifference and indolence. One that I liked that the book mentioned was work and worship. Work versus worship. Acts chapter 2 gives us a showing that work and worship are different. The book gave an example. And it says, I don't use a whole lot of the anecdotes in the book, but this one kind of speaks to the point. He is a good worker in the church, we often hear. What does he do, we might ask? Oh, he leads prayer at the services and helps serve the Lord's Supper. Truly, we have confused the work and worship of the church. You know, because we've gotten so busy, maybe, we look at what we do in a worship service as being work. And it's really two different things. That's why I mentioned earlier, you can't say, just because I attended this service, and this service regularly, but I don't do anything else, that you're working in the church. You're worshiping, and that's great. You're doing that. You've got to worship. That's part of it. But if that's all you're doing, you're not working in the church. Acts 2:42 mentions how the early church worshipped. But then you turn over a couple chapters, in verse 5, chapter 5:42 and 8:4, it talks about the local church doing works. It's two different things, two different settings, two different things, but both important to the kingdom and commanded by God. So work versus worship. And then the last one, words for works. It's easy to talk about what we're going to do, talk about what we need to do, talk about what should be done, or maybe what someone else should do. It's a lot harder to actually do it. We want to hear the words "well done," not "well said." I think the book puts it. You know, Matthew 25, 21, and 23. Well done is what we want to hear. Acts chapter 9, verse 36. Dorcas, there are works that she did. It emphasized that she was full of good works that she did. Not just thought of them, formulated them, planned them, but actually went out and did it. That's all the book has, and the bell's rung. Any other comments? Any other reasons we need to watch out for? I hope this has been a good study of the last 13 weeks. I think the way this lesson ends, the theme should be go out, do good works, and fulfill the mission of the church. And part of those works is reaching out and finding souls to bring to Christ, and being a visible part in the community, a visible part working out the mission of the church, which is to seek and save the lost. Once again, I hope you all enjoyed this study. As those of us, I've talked to all of us who had the privilege of teaching, and we all enjoyed it. We appreciated all the comments that have been made from you all throughout this quarter. It's been great. I hope you got a little something out of it, and I hope you plan to stay for our meal. Thank you.